For a child is born to us, a son is given us, and upon his shoulder all dominions rest. He will be called the Prince of Peace, Christ the King. About a year ago, I was visiting some parishioners of mine in the local hospital, the Newton Wellesley Hospital, and it was just about dusk. It wasn't dark yet, but it wasn't exactly light either. It was the end of the day, the very beginning of the evening. And I live probably no more than 5 or 7 minutes, if there's no traffic, straight down the street. So I was going back to my own parish, my own church. And as I started to drive out of the parking lot of the hospital, down this very straight stretch of road, something strange started to happen. The world started to look a little different, and I didn't quite understand what was happening. The hue of the street started to change. The glow of the trees became slightly different, and I didn't know what was happening. And as I got closer and closer to my final destination, probably a couple of miles away, things continued to change. Slowly, the hue was changing. The color was changing. I thought there was something wrong with my vision until I realized what was happening. Very slowly, beginning seemingly at the moment I got in my car to drive away, the street lights were going on, light by light by light. And it was the light from the street lamps that was changing the hue of the street. It was the light that was changing the way the trees glowed against the now darkened sky. The light was making changes. We celebrate this day the young woman whose faith, the young woman whose relationship with God allowed the light to come into the world. That first reading from the Old Testament, a reading that she would have been familiar with herself growing up, going to synagogue. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. And Mary knew of the promise. She knew that her God, the God that she related to so well, had promised a Savior, a Prince, a Wonder Counselor, someone who would shoulder that darkness and enable the human race to bring about great change, transformation. For in the fullness of his life, this yet-to-be-born child, light would continue to shine. His light would shine through anyone who opened themselves to relationship with him. I often wonder what little Mary thought of when she heard these readings. Well, she did say yes. And in the gospel, we're reminded of that fateful day when during, in all likelihood, a moment of prayer, Mary was touched by the message of an angel, the word of her God, inviting her to say yes. And she did. She never doubted. She wondered how it would happen, but she never doubted that God could work miracles even through her. And she said yes. And my friends, the history of the world changed in that moment with her yes. For it was her Son, Christ the King, that would bring about through his death and resurrection this great change, the ability for human beings to shine with his light. You and I live in a world that still all too often is filled with darkness. Our culture, our society, sometimes our own church can be touched by that darkness. And yet there is, you and me, people willing to open our ears to his voice, our lives to his presence. And we are reminded this day that her Son being King, we name her Queen, and we place her ever before us as a model of perfect humanity. We are able to reach that perfection when we say no to darkness and yes to His light, His presence, His power, His strength. My friends, in a very real way this day, you are reminded that Jesus is still with us, that He still acts in us and through us and for us. All we need do in some way each day is, like Mary, say yes to His power, His presence, His goodness, His light.